Welcome to Tough Conversations with David Wood, where play meets depth. We help teams and high-performing leaders like you to master your tough conversations so you succeed in your career and in your life. When we avoid tough conversations, we stay small. Teams stay disengaged, conflicted, and ultimately end up quitting. When we lean in and master our tough conversations, they become the defining moments that literally shape our careers, our relationships, and our lives. So let's dive in and master your next tough conversation so you can be the leader that you would follow. Let's play.
It's actually, I would like a castle. I would like a little mini castle for my family. I love castles. My family loves castles. We go and see all the palaces and castles because it's just so Magic the Gathering. It's so wonderful.
Welcome, Real Nation. I'm excited about this next guest. I have appeared on his podcast 4 times, so it's time that we start balancing it out. And I'll read his bio in a second, but he is a good friend. He is a genius and a really wonderful man who knows a lot about fully living life. Derek Loudermilk is the best-selling author of Superconductors and Activate Your Life, high-performance business coach, founder of Adventure Quest Travel, digital nomad, international speaker, and host of the Art of Adventure podcast. Derek Loudermilk is a former pro cyclist and extreme microbiologist. We haven't had many of those on the show. Turned professional adventurer, author, lifestyle entrepreneur, and father. Welcome, Derek Loudermilk.
David, thanks for having me.
Sure. So we're going to talk about something that is very exciting to me, which is the concept of living with an adventure mindset. And to me, I can't really distinguish that from daring. And I wonder if you can distinguish the two, or is there any difference, or is daring the same as living with an adventure mindset?
So the elements of adventure, there's 3 components of an adventure. The dictionary defines adventure as an interesting or remarkable experience. And remarkable sort of means that you're remarking about it, you're telling a story about it. So adventures have a story to tell about the adventure. There's an element of risk, real or perceived risk. Maybe it's your physical harm, or maybe it's just, I wonder if people will laugh at me. And so there's this element of risk. And there's also an element of transformation, of change the adventurer undergoes. Once they come out of the adventure, they are not quite the same. They're a different person, or they think differently because of the adventure. So the adventure is a process, and I think daring is part of that risk, that willingness to take risk. And daring and bravery is something that you can practice in the course of an adventure. And it is a practice. Daring is something that you sort of bring yourself to do when you're scared or uncomfortable or out of your element or feel like a beginner, and yet you do it anyway. And so it's sort of an attitude that when you're facing risk, that's your opportunity to be daring.
Right.
If something is uncomfortable and you say, I don't want to do it, then basically you're just letting whatever happens. So you're essentially giving up your free will for the sake of comfort in the moment. And we do that because comfort is much easier. It's easier to just sit on the couch and watch some Netflix or do your normal routine than it is to try to have an adventure because of the discomfort, but also energetically, biologically, rewiring our brain or doing something new causes energy. So our bodies want us to be in a lower energy state. So it's actually, it is a bit of an uphill battle to have an adventure because it's a higher energy state. What I think holds people in the fine state is because when they look at someone like a polar explorer and they think, that I can't even imagine what it's like to do an adventure like that. And so the difference in the reality of that type of adventure versus them, driving the kids to school, cooking dinner, these normal life things, is so huge that it's 10,000% more challenging. And that's just too much. Like, you're not going to do something that's that hard. But if you do something that is 1% harder or 2% harder or different, right? So if you're the type of person that cooks dinner for your family every day, then the difference might be testing out new ingredients, or testing out different ethnicities, or testing out different textures in your food, or even exploring different restaurants in your area. Like, there's these smaller steps to adventure, right, that feel 1 or 2% more challenging than your current level, and that's enough to sort of shake up your preconceived notions about who you are. We say travel, it's really easy to sort of scramble and rewire your neurons. Adventure is often associated with travel because there's so many different things that you have to sort of be aware of the differences. But you can, if you're a commuter, right, you can explore a different route home every day if you've got a little bit of time, and start to get to know your city. There's you can ask friends, like, what is a book or a podcast that really opened your eyes, right? Something outside of your normal zone that gives you that chance to explore something new. That is enough to start practicing adventure. Almost any time you do something for the first time, it's going to feel like an adventure. Because you're out of an element, because you're a beginner, and so feeling like a beginner in most situations makes people uncomfortable. Jumping off a waterfall, or saying something like, here's what's true for me, and you don't know how the other person's going to respond, right? It's this big unknown. So, right, you don't jump off a waterfall that's too big. Some people, when they come on my adventure trips, like, they're happy to jump off a 1-foot rock, right? That feels adventurous. And so if that's the level you're at, jumping off 1 foot into water, then what is the equivalent of that in terms of what you're willing to try? So maybe it's like 3 seconds of eye contact versus 5 minutes of eye contact. There's differences in degrees. And
right.
if you do something that's too challenging, right, you're just not going to want to do it. And if it's too easy for you, like if you've done eye gazing for years, well, then it's back to this sort of like, I'm pretty comfortable with this. It's a routine type of thing. In the personal connection realm, it could just be saying how you really feel about something. Like, hey, I really appreciate our friendship. At one point, that was really hard for me to say to my male friends. And then I tried it a bunch because I wanted to say that, and now it feels good.
Right. But calling your mother and saying you love her for the first time, if you've never done that in your family, or I've got a friend who's about to go and confess to a burglary he did when he was a teenager.
Wow.
And he's 40-something now, and he's always wanted to make it right. So that's an adventure for him. I want to talk about accidental adventures, because in the beginning, I started asking about daring, and I was assuming that daring was a prerequisite for adventure. And then I realized, wait a minute, is it possible that we're having adventures without realizing that they're adventures, or thinking of them that way? Like an accidental bystander, a passenger on this thing that could be an adventure?
Yeah, and so that's what Charles Darwin did. He sort of accidentally went on this huge voyage around the world, and ended up with the theory of evolution and all kinds of other geological theories, because he, the captain basically said, do you want to come? And his dad was like, you should probably go. And he was like, okay, I guess I'll go. So he was just along for the ride, and ended up all these amazing things happening from it. So you don't have to be necessarily the one to lead the adventure. If you pick a good set of friends and a circumstance that it could lead to adventure, like, you can like put in the ingredients for adventure, right? And then just sort of open it up. You know, if you're at the end of the night somewhere and your friend says, come on, let's go do this after hours thing, and you could go to bed, or you could go see what happens, right? You're setting yourself up for an adventure. You don't know that it's going to be an adventure, but you're like putting in all the recipes and ingredients to potentially have an adventure.
This is helping me right now. When I wrote down this question, I started scanning for, like, am I having an accidental adventure, or where could I be feeling like a victim for something in life, and perhaps could reframe it. And I realized this trip I'm on now is the perfect example. I don't generally like to travel. I don't like staying somewhere I don't know. I don't like sleeping in a room with other people. It puts me on edge. I like to be home in my nest. And I've now realized, like, wait a minute. I'm going to go to a camp and speak to a group of entrepreneurs. I'm going to be out of my element. I'm going to be in the woods, playing games, doing things. Like, this is adventure. And I was kind of kicking and screaming, saying, I'm just going to get through this, instead of, like, now I'm feeling my body open, and I feel lighter, and it's like, this is adventure. This is what people talk about in a story. So now I'm actually looking forward to it, still with some trepidation, I will tell you, but now I'm like, all right, this could be a really good time.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're going to get some good stories, and even if there's a bunch of pain in the butt aspects of it, all those sort of fade away, and the real juicy stuff is going to stick around for you. That's the other good thing about adventure, is that all the challenges sort of disappear with time.
That seems true to me. I don't, generally remember a lot of unless it's really traumatic, I don't generally retain the bad stuff, but if something really good happened, I'll have that for the rest of my life.
And even if it's, like remember that time we almost died in the avalanche, but we didn't. That's a kind of a funny story you can retell, but it might have been really terrible at the time, but now it's just a story.
Yeah. Well, I love that. Is there anything else that comes to mind that you want to say about, or any tips or advice about living in the adventure mindset before we wrap up?
So the other day, I forced myself to go do a new thing. We have a bike racing track here that I had never been to in St. Louis, and I had kept putting it off. And I was like, you know what? This is a recipe for adventure. I'm just going to do it. And so I use it because I'm trying to have adventures. I sort of force myself to do things because I expect that it will create an adventure. So it almost, just forces me to get out and do things, because that's the frame that I'm operating from. And it was amazing. And I met a bunch of new friends, and it was cool. And I won a bike race, and all these great things happened that I couldn't have predicted. But saying, like, okay, I'm going to do this because it's going to be an adventure, just helps me sort of get things started. Because that's kind of a hard part, is just like the first few steps of momentum.
So the first thing is declaring it as a potential adventure, and then putting yourself in the situation where an adventure can occur.
Yeah.
Right. Which, going back to the beginning, goes against almost muscle memory, where we're trying to stay comfortable. The body's trying to stay in a low energy state. So it's going to need something from us to create conscious adventures, which will require more energy. So I got that. And then notice, listeners, if you have an opportunity for an accidental adventure, that life has brought you something and you can reframe it. You might be losing your job. I've got a client whose fiance just broke up with him. Like, can you reframe this thing that's already been put in motion so that you can ride the rapids with a woohoo rather than trying to cling to every rock? Let me ask you this. If there's one thing that you could remove, one experience you could remove from your past, what would that be?
Well, I'm not sure that I would remove any, just because assuming that all these things I've learned from, even if they were messy, then I would be removing the lessons. The thing that first came to mind was I ended up getting married the first time because my girlfriend wanted to. She thought she always wanted to be married, and she said, it's sort of an ultimatum. We'd been together for a few years, like, it's time to get married or break up. And I was like, well, I don't really want to break up, and I want to make her happy, so I'll get married. But I personally was just doing it for her. I didn't really want to get married. And so that was not taking a responsibility, right? That was just letting it happen and sort of going with the flow. And we ended up, getting divorced after just a year and a half. So, besides the sort of like spending all this money on a amazing party for a wedding, there wasn't that much bad outcome. It was just sort of, I feel bad for sort of wasting her time. She's happily married now. So that's great. And so am I.
So would you say that that's an example of a regret? That's something that you wish you hadn't married just to keep the peace and to go with the flow, that you'd actually spoken to what was feeling true to you?
Yeah. So the regret would be knowing that I really wasn't into it, but doing it anyway, which is, not being true to what I really wanted.
Mm. I'm seeing this dichotomy, or like two things are true. At one level, when I look at my life and I say, what would I remove? If I could remove an incident or something, I could maybe find one or two that I would actually remove. And it's funny because I tend to live in complaint. I think we live complaining about a lot of things, but when it came down to it and you could press the button and remove something, so many good things came out of it, and we are who we are today. So in one way, there is no way to make a mistake, perhaps. But then on another level, I want to live, I want to, when I imagine my mortality, I want to imagine being on my deathbed and saying I gave it everything. So it seems, would you say that both are true, that we can't make a mistake and yet we can have regrets at the same time?
So another example that's coming to mind is when I avoid something and then it gets worse. Like if you have like a pile of mail and one of them says like, you need to respond right away, and you're like, I'll get to it. And like whatever you're avoiding because it's uncomfortable, and then it gets worse because you avoid it. Some of those I would probably undo. Like, okay, just address the thing, whatever it is, head on, even though you don't really want to. I would do those. I would take the avoidance away, because sooner or later you're going to have to deal with whatever it is anyway. And Warren Buffett says, imagine that you could only make 10 investments in your lifetime, right? So that's one, if you're investing for 50 years, that's only one investment every 5 years. So you've got to be real clear that this is one of your punches in the punch card, and you're going to use it because this is almost a once in a lifetime type of opportunity.
Wow. If you could have one thing in your life this year, what would it be? Like, as you adventure and as you live a regret-free life, what's in your pathway?
Well, it's actually, I would like a castle. I would like a little mini castle for my family. We're slowing down a little bit. But growing up, I had a lot of friends that lived in these, wonderful 150-year-old mansions in St. Louis from the sort of golden age of the city. And I always imagined myself in them. And then touring Europe, castles are, I love castles. My family loves castles. We go and see all the palaces and castles because it's just so Magic the Gathering. It's so wonderful. So right now I'm really trying to figure out how to have my own castle.
Any other tips or advice you'd have for listeners on like getting the most out of life and really living a regret-free life?
So you've probably heard of bucket lists and, the list of things you want to do before you die. The reason why those are so appealing, and I'm, a third of the way through my 110 items bucket list. And the reason it's so compelling is that each one is a little mini quest. And in the framework of a quest or pilgrimage, it gives each step along the way, it gives it meaning. So a recent one that I did was, I've always wanted a hand painted bicycle. So I really love graffiti. So I decided I'm going to look for a graffiti artist. And when I meet a graffiti artist, I'm going to partner with him to paint my bicycle. So I ran into this graffiti artist. He was painting behind this building. I was like, whoa, he was doing this Halloween graffiti. It turns out he had been hired to paint this sort of graffiti-ish mural, and started talking with him. And I was like, yeah, let's partner and you can paint my bike. So we ended up sort of talking about the design, and I gave him, he ended up painting the wheels. They're sort of blank, black carbon surface. And he ended up painting these brightly colored graffiti and symbols on the wheels. And they look so cool. And there was no real reason to do this. It wasn't necessarily going to become a business. It wasn't, it cost us time and money to make it happen. But the experience of, looking for the right person and then making it happen and being resourceful and just figuring out this all out. And now, hundreds of people stop me and say, like, those are amazing. That's so cool. I want that. It's that feels cool to have something that people really appreciate visually. But the quest, the process of making this all happen was just such a fun experience. That I really like to have those little one-off things that you're trying to do, like just a list of see what you can do.
I love it. So listeners, what's your quest? What's your list of quests? There's value in simply having a quest and going about the process of being cause in the matter and creating something in life. Derek, this is fantastic. How can listeners find out more about you?
Yeah. Since you're listening to this podcast or watching this podcast, I have a podcast which is called The Art of Adventure. I've got almost 300 episodes on there, some really cool ones. And my personal website is derekloudermilk.com.
All right, Derek, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, David.
You've been listening to Tough Conversations with David Wood. Now it's action time. Mastering your tough conversations will have a major impact on your team, your company, and you as a high-performing executive or entrepreneur. If you're ready, request a discovery session with me at playforreal.life so we can transform your team, your company, and you. And if you've enjoyed this episode, I would love you to help me spread this message of tough conversations in a very simple way. Just leave a public review at playforreal.life/podcast. And you may hear me read it out loud and thank you live on a future podcast. Now, let's play.